Welcome to the session on getting into service design. My name is Lou Downe and I am the co-founder of the School of Good Services with my business partner, Sarah Drummond, who's also on the call today. We both have very different journeys into service design, and we run all sorts of courses and training and coaching activities to help people on their career journey in service design, wherever they may be. And the reason why we're running this session is really because getting into service design feels very difficult right now. I think it's never necessarily been an easy thing to do. And we certainly get a lot of questions on all sorts of courses that we run, really around how to do this best and how to make best use of all of the resources that are out there to help you do that. So this session is really about that, about giving you some ideas and some thoughts around how to get into service design if that is something that you want to do. So we shared a poll really for some questions before this session, and we had 200 questions, which I think is a real testament to really how many questions we actually have around getting into service design and how important this discussion actually is. And a lot of them focused around things like what skills do we need in order to be able to get into service design, where we need to focus our energy and our effort. What's going to get us the greatest chance of moving into those sorts of roles. What does it look like? What does it feel like to move from other disciplines into service design? There's a lot of adjacent roles close to service design. So how do we do that? And what resources should I read or access? So loads and loads of questions, and we will try and answer some of them at the end. If we don't get to all of them, then please do just kind of post them in the chat as well. We'll have a free discussion part of the conversation at the end for us to talk about that. But I would imagine probably there's so many that Sarah and I will probably end up producing a blog post to answer some of the other questions as well, because there are so many questions. But one thing I do want to say at the beginning of this session is that there is no single route into service design. And hopefully where we'll end up at the end of this session is really valuing the kind of unique journey that we will all take into this as an activity, whether or not we want to do a formal role of service design or not. And certainly, you know, my own route into service design has been very wiggly. I studied fine art originally, graduated at the beginning of the financial crisis when there was no jobs around in fine art, moved into doing production work in art galleries. So I worked for the Tate for a few years, helping to do their audio and video tours. I kind of thought at some point that I invented service design because I sort of walked into the gallery and realized that someone was putting up a sign saying, please don't use your mobile phone, when I was making a mobile phone tour. So I thought, oh my goodness, service design feels like something that should be a thing. And obviously, because I didn't know it existed, thought, wow, this is a fantastic invention. And obviously realized very quickly that it existed. So I spent a little while in consultancies, kind of crafting the trade of kind of designing services in the public and private sector, then moved into government, where I eventually ended up being Director of Service Design and Standards there, and then wrote the book Good Services to sort of encapsulate everything that I kind of learned, and now run a training school. So my journey has been as wiggly as anyone else's into service design. And I know Sarah's has been as well. Sarah, do you want to tell a little bit about your journey into service design?
I actually studied design, which is sometimes helpful, but we will reflect on that at the end around qualifications and how useful they are and maybe other routes in. But I studied product design, and the day I actually left, I entered a competition called Social Innovation Camp to find ways in which technology could be used to bring about social innovation in different parts of life. I came up with an idea called My Police, which was a police feedback tool at the time. It's when the police didn't use Twitter or anything like that, so I feel a little older now. And we actually accidentally won the competition, and that gave us a little chunk of money to start developing a digital tool. I was bluffing. I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never designed a web-based service in my life, but I got stuck in the deep end. And through that, ended up establishing Snook, which I know some of you know. I've connected with you over before, which I ran for about 12 years and grew from a tiny duo of 2 people in Scotland to about 90 people across a few locations in the UK. We did loads of different service design work. And in terms of sort of progressing parts of my career into more like strategic sort of service design work, I ended up joining a couple of boards, namely Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park and a mental health charity called With You, and that led me to sort of develop, I guess, in my career as a service designer as well. And I know we've had a few questions about that. How do you actually take the next step? So I'm now still a board member of Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, helping them do services like find walks in the national park and help people not take poos outside. For real, that is a service we're actually working on, which is a bit strange. And I then went on after merging Snook into a large technology firm to become a chief digital officer at NEC UK. But my route was originally in physical products, coat hangers, lampshades and bicycle stands. And so hoping today to just share little bits of that journey as well on kind of how to move from one discipline into another. But that's enough from me. Yeah, back to Lou.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, I think out of the two of us, Sarah is the only qualified designer with designing on any kind of qualification, but we've both got very different journeys into this discipline, both, yeah, completely valid in totally different ways. So today, what we're going to be talking about is really sharing some stories from ourselves and from our speakers that might help you on your own unique journey into service design. And showing that there is no right way of doing that, but there are some useful things that you can think about along the way. And that's why we want to have this conversation. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah to introduce our brilliant speakers in just a moment, but we're going to hear from two speakers with very different experiences of service design deliberately so that we get a kind of really interesting picture of what this looks like. We're going to have some tips from me and Sarah, and then we're going to have a discussion at the end. But Sarah, do you want to introduce our first fantastic speaker?
Yeah, great. I'm so chuffed that Sofia is joining us today. So Sofia Kakembo is a user experience researcher. I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, Sofia, but you can correct me, at Atypon, who are a market-leading publishing platform owned by John Wiley and Sons. And actually, I met Sofia through one of our courses at the school. And one of the reasons I asked her to come on is that she's taken a route into service design and doing sort of service design orientated work, but coming from a kind of public relations and communications background and sort of having a bit of a light bulb moment. So she's here to, yeah, share her sort of journey, having a bit of time to reflect on it now and how she got into doing user experience and service design work. So I'll hand over to Sofia. Really excited to have you here if you want to jump on and start sharing your presentation.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sophia, and I've been invited to share some of my reflections on how I became a service designer, coming from a non-traditional design background. But before I dive into that, I wanted to take a moment to clarify that what I'm showing today is based on selected elements from early experiences in my own personal journey into service design. Having said that, my journey is still an ongoing process. Some of you might recognize this image. I first encountered the process of design squiggle whilst working at an agency. In my previous careers, having perfectionist tendencies was useful. It took reading Creative Confidence by Tom and David Kelly to help me realize and work on moving away from its toxicity. And coming from a non-design background, renouncing perfectionism and recognizing that noise and uncertainty is part of the process were some of the more unnerving yet necessary early parts of my professional development. I'm going to use some principles from design thinking to frame how you too could navigate a messy, non-linear journey into service design. With hindsight, if I think of the first 5 years of this career track, I boomeranged across different phases within the double diamond, whilst navigating different roles within the design thinking ecosystem. Today, I self-identify as a senior design researcher and service designer, and I've taken those skills and experiences with me into my current position, working embedded in the Atypon Design Studio as a user experience research lead specialist, and I'm a team of one. But I've got ahead of myself. Let's go back to the beginning. I think my path has been less intelligent design, more of a big bang event. But for this session, I'm going to share with you my origin story, otherwise known as My Journey into Service Design from a Non-Design Background, to help you consider how to navigate your own personal route through this ever-evolving design thinking universe. I'm going to loosely use and apply the lens of the 5 design thinking steps to explain and show how I got into service design, and by extension, share an example of how you could too. But as you can see, it's not a linear process. When we get towards the middle ideation section, I'll share more practical suggestions of how you can get digital or physical experiences to put into your own portfolio, which could help you if you're currently struggling with the important doing part of service design. But first, some context. In 2019, before the pandemic, I left an established career to take a junior part-time rights and licensing role in a large academic publishing company because I was planning on returning to university to pursue a full-time postgraduate degree in publishing. When I joined that company, I was intrigued by the product management team's work. They were doing a lot of stuff, really interesting stuff around innovation and change management. I decided to approach them to see if they had any business problems I could work with within the context of my master's dissertation. My approaches and proposal were welcomed and my efforts were well received. Meanwhile, COVID was happening, but luck was on my side, as it actually enabled me to enter into 100% remote working and 100% remote studying mode, which freed up at least about 15 to 20 extra hours per week, as I didn't have to commute anywhere. Then, after completing my master's, when I wasn't sure which professional path I wanted to follow next, I started looking into product management as a possible career. I was still working part-time in rights and licensing, and I'd been asked to tailor my academic research for commercial use too. I was rolling it out globally on behalf of the product team, which I really enjoyed doing and I could personally afford to continue to do in my spare time. But the situation wasn't sustainable, and those things had an impact on what was to come next. 3 years, 11 months, and 8 days ago, on the 25th of May 2020, George Floyd was murdered by a police officer in Minnesota. That led to a sequence of events that catapulted me into service design. The way the company I was working for was responding to his murder was well-intentioned, but misguided. I recognized from experience that they were on track to fail if they continued to use the approach they were trying to take on, and in order to effect positive transformational change within the company. But they were trying. And they were at least doing more than just changing their social media profiles to a black square. I started to think about how I would approach it differently. I spoke to people, I read a lot, and soon I realized that my approach was not in fact unique. It had a name. I was partly talking about design justice and partly about human-centered design thinking approaches. Finally, the penny dropped. I was in fact advocating for using a service design approach. And with that, I made a decision to be part of the solution. So because I'd already built up strong relationships with some key senior stakeholders, I was able to advocate for a service design approach to be considered for use to deliver the company's DEI goals. And I was inadvertently starting to help create the conditions to do service design, whilst at the same time learning about service design through doing, attending events, and continuing to read widely. My journey into service design started with empathy, but it wasn't plain sailing from there. So while this was going on, I had communicated my needs to my employer, and they were looking at creating a suitable service design role for me to transition into. And concurrently, I was still defining and refining what my needs were, but I knew my why, and I knew these 3 things. I knew I needed to find a position where I could learn more about and actually do service design. I knew my salary had to start making sense. And I wanted to keep open the possibility of enrolling into a part-time PhD in the future. However, after attending my first 48-hour online global service design jam, I was headhunted for a design researcher role and invited to apply for a position at an agency full of experienced service designers. So even though the title wasn't service designer, the role, the work, and the company aligned with my basic requirements, making the difficult decision to leave much more straightforward. I'm going to pause here from my story to reflect on the concept of ideation, the third stage of the design process involving generating ideas and solutions to a problem, within the context of getting into service design from a non-design background. I remember clearly that when I was originally looking at opportunities to get into service design, I was initially stumped as to what to include. As a non-designer, a visual portfolio was not something I ever had to pull together before. But I think building a portfolio is a very useful exercise, as it helps to tell our story and reflect upon our skills, experiences, and impact. It's natural to have doubts. It's part of the process, and to paraphrase Simon Sinek, I would suggest to start with your why. Figure out how, in order to understand what you need to do. You certainly don't need the official service design job title to start thinking like a service designer, and more crucially, doing elements of service design. You do need to have something to put in your portfolio. Find ways to apply service design approaches in your current job, in side projects, or whilst volunteering, but also take this time to understand your personal reason to start. Knowing my why served me well during the more challenging times later on in my career. I also managed to build experiences wherever I could, not for a job, but to understand what I actually wanted to do. I intentionally immersed myself in all things service design and built up a portfolio of experiences. In the early days, before I'd actually worked on anything, I was able to explore unconventional ways to build my service design skills and experiences. So, for example, by participating in the Global Service Design Jam. And I can reassure you that if you do participate in one, you'll come out the other end having a concrete experience which you'll be able to turn into a case study. And more than likely, the facilitators, if you keep in touch with them, may even help you refine your story. Doing, however rudimentary, is the only way to build and learn and build up a portfolio. The other suggestion I have for you originally came through my own self-styled design thinking community of practice friends. Through them, I discovered that Alta University runs an online Basics of Service Design course as a prerequisite to their Service Design Projects course. The first course will teach you about service design and give you both a case study you can talk about as well as international experience. In the second course, if you need it, you can work on a live project with a real company. And the course has a big focus on sustainability too. Now, with at least 2 case studies, one in person and one online potentially, you can start to tell your story, show your skills, and display your experiences in a portfolio, your portfolio. I approach the process of preparing for interviews as an exercise in prototyping and testing. I don't expect to get every job I apply for, but I do track my metrics and I actively listen to feedback. But you might be wondering what to include and exclude in your portfolio. At the time, Snook, before it was bought by NEC Digital, had a portfolio template which I modified for my very first portfolio. Remember, your portfolio doesn't have to be perfect, it has to be done. Or, as a friend once said to me, it doesn't need to be out of this world, it just needs to be out in the world. Through my informal community of practice, during this early stage, we used to create and test things out with each other regularly too. For the purposes of this presentation, on the left are some slides from that early Snook template, a mock-up of what that could look like. And this is the original intro page from the Snook template. So from a 48-hour global service design event, for example, you could talk about the situation and challenge, the tasks, actions, and results in terms of impact and quantifiable results. Then I test my portfolio with my service design friends. I also keep reading, learning, engaging, doing, and applying when looking for a suitable job. I usually focus on jobs that I know that I can add value to beyond the role, so that my other skills and experiences can be viewed as an asset. For me, the interview process, and then if your application is successful, the job itself, is still part of the testing. I've got to the stage where I see it as a two-way process. I'm evaluating whether this is where I want to be and can add value, as well as develop my career. Some tests work well, others not so much. It's meant to be an iterative exercise, and I take the process seriously. For example, I always analyze my success metrics and track my data in an Airtable dashboard. Over the years, I've been interested in and explored various elements that coexist within this human-centered design thinking ecosystem. As you're here, I'm assuming that you too are in discovery mode and searching in order to define your own path. I hope my story inspires you to see how it's possible to create the right conditions for yourself to do service design. I hope you feel empowered to take suitable action, embrace the mess, and start where you are, as you are, safe in the knowledge that overcoming challenges unique to your situation is part of the process. Each role I've had has enabled me to be clearer about what I'm looking for in a company, in a role, and that stage of my career. And always remember, being a service designer is about what you do, not just the title that you have. Finally, I want to encourage you to empathize with yourself, understand your own journey, your own why. Define opportunities, craft your very own origin story. Ideate, embrace the messy, non-linear path into service design. Find ways to use your other professional experiences as your superpower. Prototype, build your living portfolio through actions. Build your own personal support network. Talk and test new approaches wherever you can with them. And test. Keep iterating. And don't forget to take care of yourselves and each other. Thank you. I'll jot some of the links in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sophia. That was fantastic. I feel like I was clapping all the way through that, and I can see lots of really great reactions. Yeah. Oh, I'm going to save all of my thoughts for the end because I'm just itching to kind of reflect on that, and I'm sure we all are. But I want to just make some space to introduce our next speaker, Stephen McCarthy, who is director of, and it's covering over, my screen is covered over the moment, director of product design and user research at Which. And the reason why we wanted Stephen to share his experience was because he's had a very different route into design and is now coming at this also from the perspective of an employer. So we wanted him to share some of his thoughts on this, on his own career. So over to you, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Cool. Yeah, what a great talk, Sophia. Thanks very much. And hopefully there's some good kind of overlap with my talk here. So as Lou mentioned, I'm coming at this from an angle of, when I have the most recent role we opened, I had over 300 applications. I sifted through every single one of them myself. It's one of those ones where you start to build a broader picture of what stands out for you as an employer, as a person assessing applications and stuff like that. But yeah, you'll find there's a lot of overlap between what Sophia said. So that's really amazing. So how to sell yourself. The first thing I would advocate for is avoid overly formulaic portfolios. And this is something that is a manifestation of lots of these courses that have kind of manifested themselves over the last 5 or 6 years that are great at kind of rooting people into UX design and service design and stuff like that. UX design they're normally geared at in particular, but what's happened off the back of that is a lot of portfolios I'm seeing over time are the exact same. They go through really structured, this is what the project was like. And as Sophia mentioned, in the real world, nothing is that linear. So another thing as well is don't just show me an image of a double diamond in isolation. I want to see the mess. And I think this is something that Sophia articulated very well. And what I mean by that is no design project is ever perfectly linear. So what I want to see is touch on your thought process, your insights, your failures, and your iterations. Like show the kind of dirty mess that is. Nothing is going to be perfect where you had this idea, you had a how might we statement, you developed some paper prototypes, and all of a sudden you had a perfect prototype and all good. That's not how the real world works of design. And I think what's really important as well is when you're presenting your portfolios, folks like myself who are, as I said, going through probably hundreds of applications at any one time, they don't have time to read the thesis. So use visuals to support your narrative and don't over explain. I'd actually say it's really important to to leave a little bit to the imagination, and for onward conversations afterwards, kind of leave a little bit of intrigue about what areas the employer might want to dig deeper into and stuff like that. So I think it's important that you're not, given kind of, 10,000 word case studies. It's just no one's going to read them. And so I'd avoid against that. Another thing as well is try to speak to real life work where you can. And this speaks to what Sophia was mentioning as well around, try to articulate previous work you've done when you weren't necessarily a designer, but you brought design thinking into your process. I think it's fine to show in your portfolio, particularly if you're an early career designer, like stuff that you might have done that might be, voluntary, or it might be a university project and stuff like that. But where you can, try to speak to real life work. Even if it's not fully formed and you don't have that perfect end-to-end experience of design, it's really good to see these real world examples. And I have to say, it is really important to care about how it looks. I know this is general presentation here is geared towards service designers, but like obviously from a holistic design, user-centered design perspective, it's still no matter what design discipline you're in, you still can't shirk this. You have to consider and care about how it looks, because you're the one that's going to be selling this narrative to the person who's looking to employ you, who you're looking to get a job with. And if they see that you don't care about those kind of things, about the kind of how you're packaging your portfolio up, that's something that will resonate with somebody in a negative way. So it is important to care about how it looks. So if you need to upskill in that space, what visual design is around aesthetics, there's plenty of kind of material out there to get a good basis for this. And there's plenty of, as Sophia touched on as well, portfolio templates and stuff like that out there that will help you in this process. So it's really important that you don't hide your non-design work experience. And this is something again that was touched on by Sophia, but it's really important that you don't shirk that past, because that's where a lot of the rich stuff is coming from, where that's going to make you a well-informed and a well-rounded designer. And it's really important to be able to articulate your transferable skills. So what I mean by something like this is I worked in customer support before. That means I have a good essence in how I understand customer pain points. Or I studied law can transfer as I've great attention to detail. Or I was an actor, and that means that translates that I'm good at presenting. I can tell a story. And this is a real world example of someone who I've hired recently, and I can honestly say it's probably been one of the best design hires I've ever made. They had this really different background into what they are now, a product designer. But all this has led into a person who I see as a really, really high performing designer. And they cover off aspects of the discipline that people often struggle with. Like some designers would struggle with attention to detail when it comes to research, or some designers would struggle with how to present and articulate their ideas. And if you have skill sets or past experience that helps you in these areas, definitely talk about them in your application process. And this I know this sounds kind of obvious, but it's really important to me when I'm reading applications that you show that you can demonstrate curiosity and a growth mindset. Talk about courses you've done or you're doing. Talk about how you've brought design oriented ways of working and processes into your day-to-day job, even when you weren't a designer. And again, this echoes what Sophie was saying earlier, because even if you don't have that job title, you can start informing your practice with design, service design methods and UX design methods and design thinking methods. Dare I say design thinking? But I think it's extremely important that you're not being blocked, unless you have an employer that is very narrow-minded. You're not being blocked from starting to inform your practice, whatever discipline you're in, with these methods. Again, show how you've been collaborative and accountable in the work that you've done. You'll hear a lot when you go into organizations of various sizes, like your ability to work cross-functionally. And that's something that I look for and by cross-function, I mean with people who aren't just other designers, people who work in different disciplines or different departments within an organization. If you can start to demonstrate that even in a non-design role you're in, that's something that's going to give you real plus points. And then if you can start to speak to what outcomes have you helped enable within your organization, whether that is things like increased customer engagement, satisfaction, loyalty, retention, start to highlight those things, because that's really important and something that people will look out for. And this, what I've deliberately bucketed this kind of statement together because sometimes people separate them out a little bit too much, but it's really important to show how you can demonstrate empathy with users, but also commercial awareness. And I think these things aren't mutually exclusive. So we often think of as a design role that, you know, we consider user needs, we do user journey mapping, we care about usability and accessibility and aesthetics and things like that. But what we aren't normally good at telling the story of is how these things influence the stuff that other people in the organization care about. So things like average revenue per user, ARPU, like retention curves, conversion rates, acquisition trends, you know, how you work to objectives and key results, OKRs within your organization. You're not going to directly own these things on the right hand side, but almost certainly the work you're doing on the left hand side here is going to influence these things on the right hand side. So if you can speak to that, that's like definite plus points within your application. I'm just going to touch on something here as well around kind of facets that I see of a high performing designer. So this kind of generally falls into these buckets, which are around craft and execution. So like how you design and ship quality solutions for your users. The other aspect of this is around strategy and impact. So how you understand and support the delivery of products that solve user problems and drive positive business outcomes. And then the behavior and mindset you bring to the work. So how you communicate, collaborate, and lead in order to influence better decision making and outcomes. So when I kind of delve into craft and execution, this for me, as I said, is all about how you design and ship quality solutions to your users. And what that kind of covers is things like designing information interfaces, interactions. So how you design clear, impactful, easy to use, consistent, accessible digital interfaces. When you speak to things like designing holistic product experiences, that's all about how you design useful and coherent experiences, considering that end-to-end user journey, like how you design with evidence is all around how you use research, data, analytics, etc., to inform your practice, and how you propose decisions based on, or propose solutions based on this evidence. And then prototype and iterating is all about how you can work effectively in a multidisciplinary environment, and how you can design iteratively and understand which levels of fidelity to use to get the answers you need quickly. When I speak to strategy and impact, I'm talking about things like, you know, how you can articulate that you're designing for business impact, so you understand the bigger picture that your work sits within and the metrics around your work, and that you can, you know how to approach improving those metrics, balancing risk with reward. When I talk about designing for everyone, that's all about your understanding of accessibility and inclusivity and how you deliver products and services, and the understanding the kind of wider social context of your work and the organization you're in. Designing for digital is all about how your awareness of technological trends and innovations, the cost of your design choices and things like that. That's super important to be able to articulate as a high performing designer. And then designing across delivery stages as well. That's all about how proficient you are working through right from discovery, say, through to iterating a live product or service as well, and how you can work within those boundaries. When I speak to behavior and mindset, that goes into facets like how you approach designing collaboratively. So how you share work early and often and can bring the people on the design journey, wider stakeholder groups, but also that speaks to how you communicate and influence as well. So how you influence those stakeholders within and across cross-functional teams and organizational boundaries, and again, influence them on the power of design and research. Owning your work is super important. And that's like, whereas I often find designers are great at spotting problems, but then owning the process of delivering solutions is often where people fall off. And I think it's really important to note as well, like, I don't judge people on what's in their Figma files. I judge them on what's kind of actually delivered at the end. And I think it's that having that ownership mindset that I need to see this through to delivery is really important as a designer. And then leading and coaching is around how you actively help others and represent your discipline across teams and departments and the organization. And then growing and developing is all about having that growth mindset and how you seek opportunities to grow and develop as a practitioner and support the growth of others as well. I think it's really important to say that nobody will be brilliant at everything. And like it's super important to show an awareness of where your weaknesses are and where your strengths are. But if I end on a slightly kind of flippant note, is but don't put things like this in your portfolio or your CV where you have like, oh, I give myself 30% in Figma or 50% in Photoshop. This doesn't, as an employer, when I see this kind of stuff, I'm like, they don't really get it. Like, so if you like if you're rigorously taking notes there, this is a little thing to end on that I'd recommend taking out of your CV. Yeah, that's me. But I guess we're gonna go on to questions at the end, so I'll stop presenting now.
So much wisdom in that, which is great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. Sarah and I are going to talk about 10-ish, which must mean that Sarah's added a third one or 11th one, I don't know, into this deck, but sort of 10-ish tips when you're moving into service design. And I'm going to start off with the first one, which is don't be afraid to call yourself a service designer. It would probably take us several days to kind of talk about what being a service designer actually is, because it is complex and it's different in so many different contexts. But ultimately, no matter how much someone tells you that they are, no one is the gatekeeper for who calls themselves a service designer and who doesn't. There are many flavors of it, many different types of service design. And often what I find is when I'm talking to groups of people and I ask them to raise their hand if they are a service designer, very few people raise their hand. And then I ask people to raise their hand and say if they're designing services, and then most people do. So I think this is an ongoing kind of discussion about what service design is and what it isn't, but no one gets to decide other than you whether or not you call yourself a service designer in that context. I think that's really important. The second really related point is that service design doesn't only happen in service design roles. And I think that's come through in both Sofia and Stephen's talks there, is that there are loads of the skills that we need in service design, like critical thinking, like being able to understand and empathize with users, like being able to, facilitate large groups of people to reach a consensus that will come from so many different disciplines. And just because you don't have a formal role of service design or service designer doesn't mean that you don't get to do that job. So we can find service design happening in product ownership roles, in strategy roles, in kind of service lead roles, in customer improvement, so many other roles besides. And I think that's a really important thing to note. And yeah, Sarah, you wanted to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important thing to be thinking about when you're also looking for jobs. So, to start with looking for actual service design jobs, if you've not had a look at it, Service Design Jobs, the website, which we'll put links in when we do a wrap up, is a useful thing to find officially titled service design jobs. But what I'd also say, and I think when Sofia and I first talked about her and moving into different roles and her sort of real focus on what it was she was looking for from those roles. When you see a service design role being advertised, it's good to interview that organization as well about what kind of power and autonomy that service designer has to do their work. And if you jump to the next slide, Lou, because you might find actually that you have more autonomy in these types of roles. So if you're looking to get into service design, think about other roles that might be around managing and bringing improvement to services, like a service management role. You might find sort of quality improvement language, particularly in healthcare, as a place that you might be able to move into. If you can jump to the next slide. Just as an example, I was looking at this one to bring to this talk today. For Unite students, there is a business change manager role, and it's actually part of a huge service transformation and user experience piece of work that they're doing. And ultimately, when I went through the criteria for this, it looks a lot like service design. So when you're on the job hunt, you can find, much like what Stephen and Sofia have been saying, if you look for different roles, you'll find service design roles within that. And I would probably argue sometimes even closer to the actual service itself, sometimes than service design roles have been brought into different organizations. Next slide. Yeah.
So get experience making a service better however you can, and track your impact. I think that really came through in your talk, Sofia, and in yours, Stephen, as well. Often we can find experience doing this in our existing role. Perhaps maybe if we do have the luxury of having some time to be able to do some form of volunteering work, even if it's just a personal project as well, that can go a really, really long way in showing that, outside of the really often super valid experience you have from other jobs, that you can also apply that kind of service design lens to that work, even if it's speculative. I think that can be a really good way of doing things.
Yeah, and like the work of a service designer doesn't just sit at this kind of service level. This is a little screen grab from a piece that I wrote called Full Stack Service Design, and it's about thinking about, you know, how is the organization actually running some of its governance when it evaluates how services are performing? Have you done any work, or can you go and do work in that sort of space? Maybe change how a service gets measured, because that impacts the user experience as well, what we tend to focus on making better in a service. Or can you kind of work on elements of the culture inside an organization that will have a positive impact on meeting those service outcomes that Stephen talked about? So know that you don't need to be working on a customer journey map to be doing service design. You can be kind of looking at other layers of the stack of what makes a service. And we'll pop a link in the chat shortly to that. The next one is, if you want to get some experience working at a more strategic level of looking at services and how organizations run them, something that I mentioned at the start that I did was join a board as a trustee or some kind of elected member. And actually the first charity that I joined that I didn't mention was called Settle. And at the time there was maybe 6 people in the organization. So it was much kind of easier actually to get on a board of a charity or organization like that than it was a larger one, and sort of build your experience in that space. And it will get you to get this kind of almost like kind of 50,000 feet view of an organization running services, and it's really good experience to show that you can also work at that level. So while it might not feel like you're doing capital S, capital D service design, you are looking after services and meeting the outcomes of that organization. And if you're interested, if you go to the next slide, you can look at some things like digital trustees. Again, in the wrap up, I'll put some links to this, but this is run by Ross McCulloch of Third Sector Lab. And they match up people who are not just digital, it's a bit of a misleading name perhaps, just people who also have skills in user-centered design, things we've been talking about today, with organisations to get those kinds of skills onto board. So if that's a route you'd like to take, have a little look at that. Over to you, Lou.
Yeah, make a portfolio. I won't talk about this too much because Stephen went into it really, really well. But make it really simple and show the impact that you've had with it. Even if you just make it for yourself, to tell a really clear story about the types of achievements that you've had. Don't be afraid of putting non-visual stuff in there as well. You know, there are other ways of describing your achievements in ways that are not just, you know, kind of nice photographs of workshops and other things that you might see in portfolios. So yeah, and I loved what you said, Sophia. It doesn't have to be out of this world, it just has to be out there in the world. Such a good point there. So whatever you can say publicly about your experience, and I know some of us can't share everything, you know, so much the better, even if you have to make it quite generic and you know, kind of something that's suitable for NDAs. Something that's out there that people can read, they can see a little bit about you, is so important.
And we've created,
yeah.
Sorry Lou, I'm talking over you.
Go on.
We're not in the same room today. Yeah, Sophia mentioned that Snook, my previous company, had a portfolio template, but thanks to Sophia, actually, this was a really lovely affordance of doing this event. I've revamped it and put it back online on Google, so we've got a portfolio template. And I really want to just double up on what Stephen said about make it look good, you know, simple fonts, good layout, show you can, you know, do and understand some basic principles of design and layout and good visual experience. So yeah, that template is there if you'd like to kind of have a look at it. If you jump to the next slide, and I think Sophia, you actually sort of dropped this in, but a lot of particularly in government and civil service, they'll use this approach called STAR, which stands for situation, task, action, and result. And I find this can be actually quite a helpful way of thinking about presenting, you know, a piece of work that you've done. If you keep going, Lou. But Stephen said this, strong visual work. And, you know, if you've been NDA'd, which stands for non-disclosure agreement, so you can't really talk about your work, find a way in which you can still mock that back up if there's something that you want to show. It's quite helpful to show that. If you just keep jumping, Lou. So try to find really good visual ways to showcase this work. And as Stephen said, I won't labour on this, but, you know, you can show the end result. If you jump to the next slide, show the process of getting there and show this kind of real, it's like when you do a maths equation, the sort of formula to get there, show us what it looked like, what you did. And I personally, when I was hiring and going through portfolios, I was looking for this stuff because I wanted to ask more questions about why they made the decisions that they did. So you can kind of get to this point if you jump to the next slide, where you show the final thing, but you've really shown your approach in which to get there. And if you're working on some more softer stuff around governance or bringing change inside an organization, find ways to show that too. And if you jump to the next slide, this is a piece of work that I did with the charity I actually ended up joining the board of with you, previously called Ad Action. And we would have this when we presented our kind of case studies, when we were kind of pitching for work, less jobs, but sort of very similar process of putting together a portfolio of our work. I would show this, which is a blog written by one of the members of the organisation, being really taken to service design as something that was a really positive impact in our work. So you can show sort of governance style, culture side work as well in ways by showing stuff like this. If you jump to the next one. I think this is me again. Sorry, Lou, you've got the ends, but I'll carry on. Really try to become, hopefully you can see this in the work, and a lot of what Stephen was saying, is become an avid documenter and scrapbooker. Take pictures of and screen grabs of as much of your work as you can, so that it's easy for you to tell a story later on. So if you jump to the next slide, this is actually from my master's in design, and I was working inside a public sector organisation, and I had a camera. I mean, we didn't really have good mobile phones there, so I had a camera on me at all times, photographing meetings where I was allowed to, sketches that we did, workshops that we ran, trying to make sure that you get good photographs of your work, because it makes it a lot easier, yeah, going forward.
Yeah, and I think, Sophia, you said this really, really well. Show your interest and your passion in the world around you. And, you know, I think that goes a long way to both kind of propel your work in a way that's going to be really fulfilling and interesting for you. You know, you don't have to be a service designer in any context. You can have a particular interest in a particular sector or subject matter. But, you know, kind of cultivate that interest, follow that interest, and show that in the work that you're doing. I think that can really enrich portfolios, presentations, and CVs as well, particularly where that is kind of adjacent or relevant to the employer that you're working for. Related to this, talk about your work and you know, kind of document it, as Sarah said, but, you know, put that stuff out in the open. It can be really scary sometimes. I think, you know, we all have sort of unresolved perfectionist tendencies potentially, but it can be a really great way of just showing that you can think quickly on your feet, you know, produce kind of materials, just get that stuff out there. It doesn't have to be perfect. And even if what you're making is speculative work, you know, it can be a really great way of just showing your thinking in action.
This is I chucked a screen grab in yesterday. This is actually my first blog when I was still at uni, talking about a project, a service and a product designed around the post office. And when I was blogging this, I think I was about like 20, I don't know how old I was at the time, 22. I actually got, I was studied in Glasgow, and people in like London and other cities started contacting me about my work to ask me questions about it and come and present it in their organisation. And that was wild for me, you know, at that quite young age, sort of circumnavigating almost the kind of job application approach to people inviting me to talk about the work. So I can't say how valuable it is to, you know, publish your work early and often as you can. It can lead to some really interesting conversations that you might not have been able to have. Back to you, Lee.
Definitely. Go to events where you can and meet new people. It's amazing that Sophia, you already mentioned Global Service Jam. That's how I got into service design as well. I went along to one of these. I met someone who I really got on with. We had some really great conversations. We were on a team together, creating a, you know, kind of hypothetical service. And then she was like, you know, do you want to come and have a look at some of the jobs that we've got? Because we're hiring some service designers. And that's how I ended up in my first agency. Not to say that I got kind of backhander. I did still have to go through the process, but I didn't even know that agency existed before I met that person at that Global Service Jam. So you never know where those conversations will take you and what you will learn at those events, and they could be really valuable. And there's lots of free stuff as well. Global Service Jam is free. There's lots of really great stuff that's put on by the Service Design Network UK chapter. They have regular events and meetups and all sorts of stuff that's free as well, which you can just go along to and have conversations with people. The next one is just try different ways of overcoming that kind of cognitive bias that I think we all have of thinking that we are not quite good enough for the job that we're applying for. One way that I really like to do this is by getting a friend to review that job description, just tell you what you're good at. You know, I've done this for some friends as well. Often you'll look at that job description, you go, oh, I don't have that experience, I don't have that knowledge. And someone who knows you, particularly personally and professionally, will be able to spot stuff that actually you would overlook about your experiences. That can be a really good way of overcoming that bias that sometimes we have of thinking that we're not good enough for a job. Likewise, another thing that I like to do is to try to find creative ways to kind of imagine my future. I don't have the greatest imagination in terms of what I would like to do in the future. I tend to be a kind of 5 minutes in front of my nose kind of a person, as Sarah knows. So trying finding ways to kind of trick myself into thinking more long term is something that I need to do. So writing your future biography, that's something I used to do quite a bit, of thinking about actually what would I like to say about myself in 5 or 10 years time, and use that as a way of kind of guiding where you want to go and what types of jobs that you might want in the future. And this last one I just want to mention here is try, if you can, to never tell people your existing salary if you can avoid doing it. There are so many people who get stuck in being underpaid because jobs don't advertise their salaries and they ask you to tell you your salary, and if you're on a lower salary than another applicant, that won't be adjusted. And so we can end up with a lot of really quite bad sort of pay lack of parity in organizations for that reason. And you do have the right not to say what your salary is and to ask for a very particular amount. So that's just a small little tip for you to get paid more in your next job, whatever that job may be. And the last thing I want to say here is service design is hard. No matter what type of service design we're practicing, generally speaking, I would say it's kind of 90% of the work is creating the conditions for service design to happen. So, you know, bringing stakeholders along with us and working in workshops and, you know, putting in business cases and really doing that hard graft so that services actually happen. That is really difficult work. So please do look after yourself in this process, whatever you choose to do. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And we will be sharing some fuller answers to those 200 questions that we had at some point in the future. And thank you to our fantastic speakers as well.